All right then, everybody. Welcome. Good evening to everybody. Thanks for attending tonight's panel about Brazil 2022. We're going to talk a little bit about Brazilian politics and elections in this crucial year in our nation. As you know, since 2018, Brazil elected a far-right president whose agenda has been based on the dismantling of everything that stood for progressivism and an inclusive citizenship in the path to consolidate democracy after more than 20 years of a bloody military dictatorship. And skipping 4 years later, today, at the end of Bolsonaro's first and hopefully last term, this has been a government widely based on chaotic and organized disinformation, far-right tropes, intolerance, religious intolerance, market fundamentalism, authoritarianism, and whatnot. And to give us a better perspective on this issue and about the critical juncture that we are in Brazilian politics, we are joined by a very competent panel with competent researchers researching Brazil in a wide variety of different areas, such as the environment, communication, social movements, education, and whatnot. So we are joined tonight by Dr. Ricardo Severo, who is Associate Professor of Sociology at the Federal University of Rio Grande. Ricardo actually traveled all the way from Brazil, and we are happy to announce that because this event was supposed to happen in May 2020, and we had bought the ticket for Ricardo, and it was exactly when the university shut its doors because of COVID. So yeah, we're glad to be able to finally doing this event. We're also joined by Dr. Gabriela Di Giulio. She is Associate Professor at the School of Public Health at the University of São Paulo and is currently a visiting researcher here at the University of York at the Department of Politics, where we're all based. We're also joined via Zoom all the way from Portugal by Dr. João Nunes, who is a senior lecturer at the Department of Politics here at the university. And finally by Dr. Phil Roberts, who is a lecturer at the Department of Politics of this university and who happened to just have arrived from Brazil. He's still jet lagged, I believe, but he'll be able to share us with some great details about what he saw in his field work in Brazil. So without further ado, and this is how it's going to happen. I will be given 15 minutes to each discussant. And as a matter of courtesy to our international guest, I will give Ricardo 20 minutes because he traveled like 14 hours to be here. So without further ado, Ricardo, I think you can go first. And let me just share. So Melissa, should I change to guest? Oh, no, leave it as it is. Yeah, I'll just share the screen.
Hello.
Is that it? Are we all good?
My presentation is there.
Here, sorry.
Here?
Yeah.
Okay. So good afternoon. I hope you don't mind. I will read my presentation. So first of all, I would like to thank the organizer of these events, especially Dr. Indrajit and Melissa Williams and Rodrigo Campos for making my trip to York possible, and Melissa for her assistance. The invitation to this event, the Citizenship Futures, the Politics of Hope, sounds to this Brazilian who maintains a progressive convictions like a memory of a near past that promised a better future. Despite its limitations, this was, in a way, the overall characteristics of the period of 13 years of rule under the center-left Workers' Party, the PT, in Brazil. This is what I would like to talk to you about, and on the unhopeful side of things. I would also like to talk about how Brazilian society is structurally conservative in a way that makes hope about this year's election less optimistic than what voting polls may suggest right now. Finally, I will relate this reflection to my ongoing research about Brazilian youth, which is being funded by the National Council for Scientific Research in Brazil. So, as you may have heard, Brazil experienced certain social gains under the 13 years rule of the Workers' Party, PT, between 2003 and 16. Lula's presidential victory in 2002 led to the constitution of what has been called a period of weak reformism or social liberalism, which implied some wealth redistribution and progressive policies as long as it did not interfere with capitalist interests. But the mild progressivism of the PT years was still enough to provoke a backlash from the elites and the predominantly white middle classes when the effects of the financial crisis began to be felt in Brazil. This led to a parliamentary coup in 2016 against President Dilma Rousseff, also from PT, and the rise of far-right movements extolling conservative, Christian, anti-communist, anti-progressive values with support from business groups that pay to disseminate fake news on social media, seeking to mobilize popular consent with unhinged conspiracy theories. This all led to Bolsonaro's election in 2018. The Bolsonaro government has been marked by the systematic persecution of social movements and minorities, this dismantling of the Ministry of Labor, cuts in the resources of culture and education, the implementation of a neoliberal economic policy, the deregulation of environmental legislation, and finally, scientific denialism in the case of the COVID-19 pandemics. This government is composed by neoliberal technocrats, neoconservatives, conspiracy theorists, and the military. How was it possible to arrive at such a situation, considering that the previous 2 decades promised a growing process of democratization and improved conditions for Brazil? This is what I would like to talk about in particular. Brazil is structurally conservative, and this recent progressive past was one of the few exceptions of democratization in the country's recent history. Historically in Brazil, governments that attempted to implement measures in favor to popular sectors usually end with coups for the preservation of a power structure that perpetuates one of the most unequal socioeconomic models in the world. Marlene Chauí, a Brazilian philosopher, argues that Brazilian society, since its origin, is structurally unequal and authoritarian, whether in aspects of everyday sociability or in the way in which the state is managed, based on a hierarchization structure on class and race. We must not forget that Brazil was colonized for 3 centuries, during which time it was the largest destination of slave trade in the world, and the last country to formally abolish slavery in 1888. The sociologist Gessé Souza, in a similar analysis, calls attention to the continuity of this process. In the rare situations of attempts to break this societal structure, there is a reaction from the dominant classes in order to maintain their structural privileges. Sometimes this backlash comes in the form of fascist movements, such as the Brazilian Integralist Action, the largest fascist party outside of Europe during the interwar period, in the form of military dictatorships, such as the Estado Novo dictatorship, or the civil military dictatorships, so from 64 to 85. I'm sorry to put a picture for Bolsonaro, but that's what you have to do. The result of this long period of more than 21 years of military dictatorship is a phenomenon which, during the redemocratization period, has been called the ashamed right. To be right-wing at the time was a dirty word, and so to break away from the military regime, several politicians, most of which were certainly conservative, define themselves as belonging to the center of the political spectrum. In general, this political class defended neoliberal adjustments policies, which became popular in the country from the 90s onwards. And in Brazil, therefore, we went from an authoritarian to a neoliberal restructuring period that lasted roughly 10 years before Lula was elected. After 13 years of PT ruling, a backlash and democratic backsliding occurred, which placed this shameless right at the center of the political stage. The main issue I would like to note is that this shameless right was long in the making before Bolsonaro, and will probably continue to exert strong political power in Brazilian society, regardless of the results of this year's election. Let me try and explain for you why. In my recent research, I have tried to understand how the shameless right-wing ideology, and by ideology I mean worldviews that guide practices, are incorporated in the Brazilian youth. Such priority is given by the fact that the youth at various moments present themselves as protagonists of mobilization process, and also because they are agents of the constitution of new movements and practice of antagonism. For example, from 2015 to 16, there was a series of occupations in high schools from the improvement of physical structure and wage conditions of the professors, in addition to opposition to conservative measures being implemented by the state governments. At the same time, conservative social movements, also led by the youth, such as MBL, the Free Brazil movement, went to these schools to provoke students by filming them and posting videos on YouTube. MBL was trying to criminalize the occupation movement. So here I'm referring mainly to two ways of understanding the problem of ideology: Norberto Bobbio and Karl Mannheim. To summarize, and without ignoring other elements, the left points its projects towards the future, even if it's uncertain future, and to social relations that point towards equality, while the right seeks the consolidation and maintenance of hierarchical relations, having as its guide the past, even it is invented. Having said this, in 2019, I applied a survey to approximately 2,000 high school students in the southern state of Brazil. Among many questions, I asked them what would be their political profile based on their self-declared ideology on a 10-point scale, 1 being extreme left and 10 being extreme right. Thus, it was assumed that profiles would be found based on this self-identification, making it possible to analyze what Mannheim called generational units. For example, Bolsonarist youth groups that emerged from digital platforms, or young feminists who started to organize themselves after the 2015 school occupations. After this stage of the research, 44 interviews were carried out with respondents to seek a deeper understanding of their self-declared positions. Here are some of the characteristics of the profile respondents. Doesn't appear the first one, but the average age of the respondents are 16.78 years, okay? The gender, 50.8 female, 49.1 male. The color or race, especially in the south of Brazil, is very different from the total characteristics of Brazil. In the southern states, there is a majority of white people. So here you see 70% of white people, 10% of black people, and 60% of mixed race. Mixed race in Brazil, it's a very particular form of self-identification. We call Pardo. The type of school is 65.7% state, that's public schools with listed resources, private with 19.5%, and federal, also public, with 13%, and religion, that's interesting, 35.7% is not religious, the most of them different from the population, Catholic 30.4%, and evangelical 70%. And evangelical in Brazil are growing up every year. Before going to the details of the ideological units, I would like to draw attention to some hypotheses that have been raised about the change in the newer generations of youth, in particular about the loss of importance for what is understood as traditional institutions such as family, school, and church. At the beginning of the century, there was a dazzle about new forms of sociability, based on the internet and the change of in forms of organization, especially political ones. This follows general secularization thesis, which expected the decline in regional belonging with the capitalist development, technological advancement, and modernization. My research is only one among many to disprove this thesis among the younger generations. For example, in terms of the most reliable source of information consumed by the youth, family members stand out with 34%, followed by teachers with 25.8%. And interestingly, the less reliable source of information is social media in special, with an incredible 69% of mistrust. Moving on, with regards to self-identification on the ideological scale, 72% of the respondents were able to clearly situate themselves in the spectrum, the distribution being as follows. Extreme left 8.8%, left 21.4%, but I want to call attention for the last one, no identification. In general, in this political science, the analysts call attention, understanding that a formal ignorance about the scale or our self-identification between left or right. So the first group I would like to address are those who claim not to identify with any political position. Before treating it as ignorance on the scale, it is possible to state that it is an active posture of distancing oneself from politics. They do not have the habit of talking about the topic, and neither do they participate in activities related to politics, especially as a way to avoid conflicts with family members and peers. Such position has similarities with those who identify themselves at the center of the political spectrum, their main characteristic being to rarely talk about politics. The units observed between the profiles of the right and the left calls more attention, especially considering the current political context in Brazil. A general characteristic is the approach to the political debate since the 2018 presidential elections, both in the family environment and at school. They are not young people who in general have become politicized in previous political processes. I will group these groups 1, 2, 3, 4 in one as left, and 7, 8, 9, 10 on the right, on the other side, to facilitate the explanation also by the proximity of their characteristics. Young people who define themselves as right-wing are in general male, white, and of Catholic or evangelical faith. The stronger the influence of religion, the further to the right they are. The most reliable source of information for these young people is their families. They do not have the habit of participating in political activities, nor do they talk about politics, except in the family environment. It also influences the fact that they are students from the private schools, which may be related to their class origin. In the interviews, two main orientations appeared: conservatism with religious basis, which is equivalent to being concerned with the family, and against gender ideology. For example, an economic liberalism, especially the concern with state intervention, seen as something negative and potentially conducive to socialism. They are not in favor, in their majority, of free debate in the school's environment. In the speech of these young people, we note disappointment with the current president, Bolsonaro, and their values are not linked to Bolsonarism. Young people who define themselves as leftists are generally women, Black, without religion, or agnostic. and are students from public schools, especially state schools. Just a quick explanation. State schools have the least resource for structure and the lowest wages. These young people have the habit of talking about politics and have previously participated in demonstrations. The most reliable source of information for them are their teachers. Another contrast that deserves to be observed. So two orientations appear as more significant for these young people from the left, this in dialogue with one another, which does not necessarily occur among young people from the right. An active orientation in the sense of seeking information, of participating in debates, and especially a strong academic component in their statements, in the sense that on many occasions, it is at school that they present themselves as the preferential space for political discussion. The other orientation may be called egalitarian, or even anti-hierarchical, placing as something crucial the fight against homophobia and racism, workers' rights, and drug discriminalization, the latter less frequent. We are in favor of unrestricted debate in the school's environment, and they are obviously anti-Bolsonarists, but not necessarily supporters of the Workers' Party. Finally, there was a frequent talk of opposition to extremes, incorporating one of the ways in which a significant part of the Brazilian media apprehends the false symmetry between Petismo, the ideology of PT, and Bolsonarism, ideology of Bolsonaro and his family. Many of these young people interviewed comment being against polarization, and in the sense, ideologically positioning themselves as being of the center, as a rule to avoid moments of conflict with the family, members, peers, or in the internet. Among these young people, there appears the dedication of position and participating as a form of social protection, especially in the current political environment in which we live in Brazil. So to conclude, the analysis of the political behavior of these young people allowed us to think about a possible future scenario for Brazil. First, that right wing can become detached from the figure of Bolsonaro, but will probably remain as a form of conservative political activism, with the importance of religion growing by the day, especially between the evangelical. On the other hand, there is a more active interest in politics on the part of young people who identify themselves against Bolsonaro. And more importantly, they generally do it through researching for information and debate, demonstrating the importance of democratic values, either by the way they act or by the defense of minorities. Finally, it worries that many of these young people, especially those who perceive a scenario of polarization, prefer to stay away from politic processes. This is likely to continue impacting the anti-political discourse climate in Brazil. These are some of the challenges for the next period of Brazil's fragile democracy. As we could see, the democratic left is still mobilized in Brazil, especially in schools. So this is a space we need to protect from the far right. So let's have some hope, and thank you for your attention.
So I'll immediately give the floor to Gabriela. Let me just stop sharing here. Do I have to do anything here, Melissa? No.
There's no presentation.
Okay, so just leave it as it is. Oh, yeah. Let's make sure you're that good.
Thank you so much, Rodrigo, for inviting me to attend this webinar. So when Rodrigo invited me to attend this event and select a topic to talk about the legacy of Jair Bolsonaro's government and this framework talking about hope, I immediately thought that this topic should be environment. Not only because over my academic career, I have developed studies focused on the interactions between environment, crisis, social cultural contexts, and how these interactions are embedded and expressed in social practice, conflict, decision-making process, always with a focus on Brazil, but mostly because if there is a specific area that clearly shows a deliberate strategy on the part of the government to produce chaos, to enable destruction, to dismantle public institutions, to disqualify and deny scientific knowledge, to threaten rights and lives, to promote violence, to amplify vulnerability, this is definitely the environment. So from a shocking increase in deforestation to the approval of thousands new pesticides, the anti-environmental agenda adopted by the federal government includes illegal mining activities that pollute our rivers with mercury and other heavy metals, jeopardize indigenous rights, health, and our lives. It also includes significant advance in the agribusiness in our biomes, and the record numbers of fires include the Pantanal, Cerrado, Amazon, and Atlantic Forest. On the one hand, these events largely contribute to climate and biodiversity crisis, even compromise the achievement of the goals established in the Paris Agreement, which are mostly based on the increase of biofuels, actions against illegal deforestation, for forest recovery, investments in clean energy, actions regarding low carbon agriculture. But on the other hand, throughout the world, people, particularly after the shocking images of Amazon fires, were calling for boycotts of Brazilian products and pouring donations into Brazilian environmental NGOs. So what we see during the past 3 years is that the federal government invested in infrastructure projects to support private land rights, facilitate environmental license, and try to suspend the demarcation of indigenous lands. The government also imposed financial cuts and dismissed the staff, weakening government bodies who are responsible for monitoring the environment. And one of the most emblematic examples of this happens to the Brazilian National Institute for Space Research, which uses satellite observations of the Amazon to track deforestation. The government also promoted the restructuring of the National Environmental Council, which involved a drastic reduction in the number of representatives of civil society. The federal government invested in a strong campaign against NGOs, described by the president as cancers for the country. We also been observed an increase of violence against environmental activists. According to the Global Witness report, Brazil was of the most dangerous countries for environmental activities in the last year. So I would say that there are so many possibilities to analyze and reflect on how the decisions made by a government like Bolsonaro's government can produce a range of negative and long-term impacts that go well beyond to short-term environmental harm. But in this talk, I will try to focus on two very short stories that I hope help us to reflect about the Brazilian scenario and to contribute to this debate if there is some hope in the end of this story. So the first one is centered on a very recent study published by my colleagues Patricia Ruggiero, Jean-Paul Metzger, and others on Conservation Letters Journal. And this study analyzed how election cycles can affect deforestation all over Brazil, but specifically within Brazil's Atlantic forest. So based on the idea that political dynamics affect natural resources, how we use and how we manage natural resources in general, their study confirmed that elections have affected deforestation in Brazil's Atlantic forest region, but also they confirmed that the mechanisms that may hold such effects differ between federal, state, and municipal levels of governance. But in common, what the authors argue is that the policymakers can promote activities that directly led to deforestation, include extension of credit, a kind of relaxation of permit requirements for agriculture, mining, real estate sectors. Policymakers can also reduce forest protection through the downgrade, downsizing, the gazettement of protected areas. They can also reduce surveillance and defund field efforts by the environmental policy, giving a kind of signal that impunity for illegal deforestation is okay. But while the authors shed light on the fact that the effect of the elections in Brazil have diminished over time, and the period that they studied is between 1991 and 2014, a phenomenon that my colleagues attributed to democratic mature in Brazil and the consolidation of environmental protection laws around the country. The bad news is that there is no guarantee that it will remain that way, particularly in the current context of political instability and the dismantling of federal environment protection laws in Brazil. Their studies calls our attention particular for this year. So for example, the annual atlas produced by the organization SOS Mata Atlântica in partnership with the National Institute for Space Research shows that there was a 72% increase in deforestation in Atlantic forest in 2018-2019 election period. Unfortunately, we are not expecting a different result in the 2021 and 2022 election period. The second story is about how fake controversies produced by a small group of active Brazilian researchers have seriously impacted environmental conservation, particularly in issues related to deforestation and climate change in Brazil. This study was recently published by my colleagues Raoni Rajão, Gerd Spadavock, Mercedes Bustamante, and others on Biological Conservation Journal. And they examined how fake scientific controversy, which means manufactured dissensions that try to influence public opinion, policymakers, can prevent regulatory policies from being put in place. The authors argued that after an unprecedented reduction of deforestation by over 80% between 2004 and 2012, Brazil has seen a process of weakening of environmental policies and the increase of the rate of Amazon's destruction. This process started with the approval by the Brazilian Congress of a revised version of the Brazilian Forest Code, a kind of suite of laws regulating nature conservation private land in 2012. Later, the administration of Michel Temer attempted to reduce and downgrade protected areas in the Amazon, send a kind of strong political signal to encourage deforestation. And the regulatory period, fueled by strong political polarization in Brazil, resulted in a 72% increase in annual deforestation rates from 2012 to 2018. To make things worse, as they also remind us, in October 2018, Jair Bolsonaro was elected as the new president with the promise to end the industry of environmental fines, indicating that illegal deforestation would go unpunished in Brazil. But what is less known in the case of Brazil, according to my colleagues, is that the assault on environmental policies was boosted by a systematic and what they call a veiled effort by a small group of contrarians to misinformed decision makers and society. So their studies provide a very interesting close look at the discourse and actions by part of the research team from Embrapa Territorial, a branch of the Brazilian Agricultural Research Corporation, a federal enterprise for agricultural research and development in Brazil. And they also argue that this specific group has a kind of significant political influence and systematically produced content used by agribusiness caucus and Bolsonaro's government to dismiss concerns about deforestation in Brazil. In particular, this group has been producing fake controversies that have contributed to dismantlement of environmental conservation policies in Brazil in the last decade, made in three strategies: manufacturing uncertainty and producing pseudo-facts, misusing scientific credentials, and disregarding scientific literature. So while these studies shed light on the fact that environmental setbacks in Brazil have started before Bolsonaro's government, there is no doubt that his administration and his anti-environmental agenda has produced a catastrophe with longer-term environment, economic, social, and health impacts. But the crucial question right now is if and how this scenario can shape the elections in next October. In other words, is the environment an important, a critical issue for Brazilian voters right now? Or as Rodrigo provoked us, are we observing a kind of a reversal shift from hate to hope in Brazil? The Brazilian political scientist Sérgio Abranches said in a very recent panel that discussed Brazilians' perception of climate change and environment that Brazilian elections might be defined by the economics. And we need to remember that our economy indicators include rise in unemployment, poverty, hunger, and inflation. However, and this is very important aspect, we can also say that Brazilian people now are much more concerned about post-materialist values, which include environmental issues. Based on a recent survey of climate change and environment perceptions, the Brazilian political scientist argues, and I agree with him, that if the environmental agenda is not enough to elect a candidate, a president, a governor, is it now an important condition because people in general have an expectation for environmental actions, and mostly important, people have suffered the concrete impacts of climate change, biodiversity loss, extreme weather events, and people know that urgent actions must be done to protect the environment, protect the planet, but also to protect themselves. This survey, which is part of a study conducted by the Yale Program on Climate Change Communication, included 2,600 interviews with Brazilians and pointed out that 8 in 10 people said that they were very worried about climate change. 77% believed it's more important to protect the environment, even this means less economic growth, lost jobs. But the most significant result of this study for our debate today is that while Brazilians understand that entrepreneurs, citizens have some responsibility to deal with climate change, to deal with environmental issues in general, the government has the biggest responsibility in this arena. Moreover, 45% of the respondents said that they already voted for a politician for him or her proposals to protect the environment. And I think that this helped us to understand that Brazilians have started to realize that regarding environmental issues, more than a critical role that they have as consumers and citizens, they can also play an important role as voters. So discussions about combating climate change and environmental degradation in Brazil is becoming a kind of integral part of the national presidential race. Our attention right now is to see how the candidates develop and present their proposals and their ideas regarding environmental issues, but most important, how voters are reacting to them. So thank you so much, Rodrigo, for inviting me. Yeah.
Thank you, Gabriela. Let's move on to João. I have to put in speaker view, is it? For João? Okay. I think that's it. All right, João.
Yeah, can you hear me? Good. All right, good evening, everyone. Thanks to Rodrigo, to Melissa, and to Indrajit for inviting me to this thought-provoking panel. I say thought-provoking because it led me to think a lot about this this binary hope and hate and hope. And I want to say something about the binary itself, hate and hope. And then I want to say something about hope. And then I'm going to move on and talk about hate. And then I'm going to go back and speak about hope again. And hopefully by the end of it, you will not hate me at all. So to begin, with this idea of hate and hope. With my apologies to the organizers, I don't think the binary works at all. I don't think that we can talk about it as being a kind of a dichotomous relationship. I don't know if this was your intention. If it wasn't, apologies. But I don't think it works. I mean, Bolsonarismo is filled with hopes. We may not agree with those hopes, but it's filled with hopes for the future. And at the same time, I think this binary is somehow politically unhelpful. It kind of re-entrenches a certain polarization, which I think is unhelpful, by ascribing Bolsonarismo and its supporters to a position of hatred, and by definition, and defining all those who oppose Bolsonaristas as being hopeful or idealists. So I think reality is a bit more complicated, and I'm not saying that you weren't aware of this complexity. I'm just saying that I tend to look at this dichotomy with a bit of suspicion. I was also wondering when I start talking about hope, and there's been some discussions about hope in the Brazilian context, and I'm reminded of a recent book by journalist and social activist Eliane Brum, in which she talks specifically about hope and the politics of hope in the response to Bolsonarismo. And she talks specifically about hope in the context of young climate change activists. And what she says is that hope in climate change debates has been turned into a commodity. It has become part of a hegemonic discourse, and younger generations, and she's talking about people like Greta Thunberg and others, they are refusing to be the objects of this hope. They are refusing this hope that is being imposed on them by the older generations, when the older generations at the UN say, oh, you young people, you give me hope. And they say, I don't want your hope. I don't need your hope. I need something else. I need you to act. So to become a source of hope for these generations is to become a decorative element, a kind of an ornamental figure. It is, in short, to be co-opted. So for these climate activists, radical action is to refuse to be subsumed by hope narratives. They don't want hope. And this is what Eliane Brum is talking about when she is also very skeptical about this notion of hope. We don't need hope. We need anger. We need panic, because we need to act now. And this is part of my initial reaction when I was presented with the title of this panel. I'm not saying that I'm against hope. I think I like hope. I think hope is a good thing. I'm just saying that we need to kind of be aware of these complexities when we're talking about a transition or supposed transition from hate to hope. It has its pitfalls, and we need to think about them. Now, let me talk a little bit about hate. I don't think that Bolsonarismo is coherent enough to be a manifestation or a simple manifestation of hatred. Surely there is a lot of hateful things about Bolsonarismo. I'm not denying that. There are a lot of people who vote and support Bolsonaro that are moved by hatred of something or someone, or a party or a political figure or a social class or a group of people or whatever. But I don't think it explains the totality of, and I don't think anything isolated can explain Bolsonarismo. There's been a lot of explanations of the far right and of far right populism that are based on ideas of hatred, or ideas of resentment of a white middle class, or a white working class. I think in general, they capture part of the phenomenon, but they cannot, I think, in any way explain fully what is happening. And sometimes they run the risk of being somewhat patronizing, in the sense that they end up ascribing either evil or false consciousness to a certain group of people who end up supporting far-right populists like Bolsonaro. I think the explanation of what is Bolsonarismo and how to go about overcoming Bolsonarismo has to include not simply this kind of transition from hatred to hope or whatever, but kind of a look at the political economy and the historical sociology of how these phenomena have occurred. And I think for me, part of what explains the current stage of Bolsonarismo, which is not the same stage as in the 2018 elections. Bolsonarismo itself has changed significantly, and the base of support has changed. The parliamentary basis of support to Bolsonarismo has changed significantly since the election. And I think it is explained mostly not by hatred, not by resentment, but by patrimonialism, and is explained by a loss of a sense of public and collective endeavor. So hate is an insufficient fuel to maintain a far-right populist movement for a very long time. Okay, it can be enough to trigger it. It can be enough to win an election, but it cannot be enough to sustain this movement. And what we're witnessing is that in spite of all of the misgivings, the mistakes, of the chaos, of the disaster that Bolsonaro has caused in Brazil, it still has around 30% of people who were supporting Bolsonaro and were ready to vote for him. Okay, so, you know, and they're not simply motivated by hate. Hate is insufficient fuel to maintain such a high level of support for such a long time in the face of so many flagrant failings. So it does not, hatred does not move the economy. It does not put food on people's tables, unless, of course, you're a YouTube influencer or a social media mogul. So I don't think at this stage that hate is the main force animating Bolsonarismo nowadays. Nor it will be the main force in the election. I think we need to look at economic dynamics. We need to understand how Bolsonarism emerged out of a failure, an economic failure of the left-wing governments in Brazil, namely the Dilma Rousseff governments. And obviously these economic dynamics intersected with identity issues, with culture, with ideology. I'm not denying that. But part of what explains the rise of Bolsonaro, and my fellow panelists have talked a lot about it, and you know, it has been mentioned that Brazil is a structurally conservative country, and it has a lot of issues with the rise of evangelical Christianism and all that. But I think there's also we need to take into account the economic factors, namely, for example, Dilma Rousseff's inability to maintain the financial and industrial elite on her side. The Workers' Party inability to fundamentally change or challenge the patrimonial and clientelistic structures of the Brazilian state. So these, I think, were strong bases for the class resentment, for the racism, for the authoritarianism, for the homophobia, the transphobia, the misogyny that is at the heart of Bolsonaro's appeal. So, but what explains Bolsonaro is not simply hate, or Bolsonaro is not simply about hate, it's about all of these economic factors. And there's a lot of hopes that are surrounding his support. Now, moving forward very quickly, let me go back to the idea of hope. And are we looking at a situation in which we can indeed make our way from hate towards a more hopeful situation? And obviously, the figure here is Lula da Silva, right? Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, who is a former president, who is currently leading the polls, and whether he can offer a more hopeful future. I mean, obviously, the next elections, as Rodrigo said at the beginning, are a very important elections. It's a generation-defining election. It is very literally a matter of life and death for many people in Brazil. So obviously, you know, it's a lot is at stake, and the victory of Lula da Silva, if it does happen, will be immeasurably better than the maintenance of a Bolsonaro government. I'm less certain about whether Lula da Silva can offer a hopeful path towards the future of Brazil. And this is because of the very nature of the Brazilian political system and the fact that Brazil is what's been termed by political scientists a presidentialism of coalition. So the president needs to rely on a coalition with the parliamentary forces. And currently, the parliamentary forces are strongly in favor of Bolsonaro because they are highly benefiting from Bolsonaro's literally handing out cash in the form of budgetary amendments. So I was looking at the composition of the Chamber of Deputies, the Chamber of Congressmen today, and it's very likely that if Lula is elected, he will be coexisting with a Congress that is actually very strongly leaning towards Bolsonaro. So at the moment, the biggest bench in the Brazilian Congress is the Liberal Party, which happens to be the party where Bolsonaro is affiliated. And the parties of the so-called center, the Centrão, as it's said in Brazil, they are very strong and they will continue to be very strong. It's very likely that will continue to dominate Brazil's political scene as they have been dominating for decades. Okay, so Lula is a master of coalitions. Lula thrives in presidentialism of coalition because he was able to establish strong alliances with these center parties. With Dilma Rousseff, this alliance collapsed and the impeachment. But it's likely that if Lula wins the election, and if he's to have a successful path towards election, you will have to negotiate, and he's going to negotiate with these center parties, which means that his policies, particularly his economic policies, will also have to be tempered by the needs and interests and agendas, very clientelistic agendas of these center parties. So adding to this, Lula is now faced with a dilemma because the Lula that run for election in 2002 or in 2000, in the early 2000s is not the same, is not running in the same political context. The economic situation is drastically different. The budgetary dynamics is also drastically different. In recent years, the Congress has assumed a central role in the disbursement of budget funds. And it is very unlikely that the Congress is going to relinquish this protagonism that was afforded by the Bolsonaro government. At the same time, civil society has changed. And I'm not sure, and Lula has not yet proven in his statements, that he has been able to follow up the pace of change in Brazilian society. So there's a lot of challenges for Lula. I still think that Lula is by far better than Bolsonaro, and I hope he wins. I wish I could vote for him. I can't because I'm not Brazilian. But this election, as I said, it's a matter of life and death. But I don't think that Lula is able to offer a path towards a hopeful path towards the future. If he wins, and I hope he wins, and this is my hope. You see, I like hope. I hope he wins, but if he wins, I won't be feeling hope for Brazil. I will be feeling relief. I will be feeling a bit of trepidation about what's going to happen in the near future. But also I'm going to feel a bit of anger because of all the unnecessary suffering caused by Bolsonaro in all of these wasted years in Brazil's history. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your provocation, João. Now, last but not least, it's Phil Brown to follow. Go back to gallery, share the screen, stick that in.
Oh. As I'm really quite jet lagged, can you give me a warning at 3 minutes and 1?
Yeah.
I'm gonna try not to run over. Where am I gonna sit? There?
Yeah,
Is that about right? Right. Is that gonna work? Yeah, cool. Hi, great. So, hello. That is a tough 3 people to follow with all this. I might speak to the elephant in the room first of all. Actually, no, I'm going to ask a demographic question first. Okay, so Brazilians, raise your hands, please. So 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, Italians. Brazilians with an Italian passport. Yeah, there we go. 1. Okay, so that's relevant information. I am not Brazilian, so it is a bit weird to be in front of several Brazilians and then a Lusophone native speaker as someone who's not from Brazil. And then I'm going to tell you lot about Brazil. Fantastic, no pressure. So in line with talking about hope, with all the reservations that João has accurately outlined, try and contextualize this with like, okay, so why am I here doing this? You have to cast your minds back a long way. I actually lived in Brazil from 2007, 2008, nothing academic, but obviously that was the year of the GFC, right? Global financial crisis. There was a degree of self-congratulation in Brazil at times, calling it the Anglo-American crisis, after having been pummeled by the IMF for having their own financial crisis a few years before. But returning to the UK from Brazil, the kind of expectation on the UK far left was, from a Marxian standpoint, here's the moment of the crisis of capitalism, this time for the project of left radical transformation, like leap into the breach, transform things, and it didn't happen. And we know what happened, right? We had austerity, we had years and years of conservative revolt until now. And that led to a degree of soul searching. The academic left, but also the activist left, to kind of say, okay, so why didn't it work? What could we have done? And at that time, when Brazil was living through a kind of brief golden years period, Brazil did become a focus of hope, saying that if we look at the Brazilian context, maybe there are lessons there that we can learn and pick up, which are going to make sense in our context. There's sympathy between the realities there. I'm going to try and tell you a story about that through the channel of research. And like João, I think I'm going to start with a bit of hope, have a real dip into misery in the middle and kind of bounce back at the end. Hopefully. I'll explain my terms as I go. But I was asking for Italians for a reason. This guy, right? So coming to researching Brazil from a sort of left Marxist perspective, this guy in the background, Antonio Gramsci, is a central reference point for reasons that I'll get into. I think in a presentation about hope, I am contractually obligated to use his one optimistic quote, which was saying that, when you look at social reality critically, intellectually, we always think the situation looks terrible, right? But in terms of organizing politically, we just have to will it optimistically. We have to be willing to believe that things can change, that hope can endure. Gramsci, famous founder of the Italian Communist Party, if you go to Italy, there's always streets named after him wherever you go, ended up being in prison. So didn't go super well. Most of what he writes we get from his prison notebooks, and they're all about trying to understand, okay, so why do some strategies succeed and why do some drastically fail? It's in the era of the Russian Revolution, the emergence of what seems like a communist alternative to capitalism. But obviously in Germany and Italy, similar attempts to establish left progressive politics absolutely failed, including him going to prison. And he has a kind of geographical metaphor here to explain what's going on. So you look at the East, it means Russia. When we look into the East, see the revolution take place, and the Leninists kind of storm the state, and that's the end of the game, right? He says it's due to the nature of the state, its character and its development. He says basically, when you look at places like Italy and Germany, although the state was vulnerable, you could go and try and attack it through an unarmed struggle in a Leninist kind of way. It was so developed, its character was different, it was much more consolidated, that something else got in the way. An armed struggle wasn't really possible. You couldn't transform society in that kind of vanguardist Leninist way. And his claim is not the liberal claim that there's a separation between state and civil society, like the politics is over here and community is over here. He's saying that they are effectively interconnected. They're the same thing, but the role of civil society is somehow to produce consent, to allow us to accept the coercion of the state and to be incorporated into a kind of class leadership led by, let's say, the bourgeoisie. So that's what he calls coercion armored by hegemony. That's why he thinks the revolutions fail. What do you do about that then? His claim was basically that you had to struggle against this, what he called the superstructure, these kinds of political and cultural activities put out by advanced or developed Western states. You had to try and occupy positions within civil society and including within government, and to try and conquer it gradually, piece by piece. This is what's called a war of position. You develop your position like developing a position in chess. And then when the time is right, you have the war of maneuver, which is the real revolution. That's the idea, right? So that's all those concepts. Why all that stuff then? There is a strong tradition, and there's parts of the presentation have been covered, but there's a strong intellectual tradition in Brazil of drawing an analogy between Brazil and Italy, suggesting that these two things are somehow sympathetic. They're comparable geographies. Someone's in the audience is grimacing, but we'll get there. In the sense of them being what we'd call peripheral social formations. Like Gramsci, when he's writing huge amounts about Italy, he's obsessed with the idea that if it's kind of a weaker country in the European periphery, and in the Brazilian sense, Brazil is this kind of less developed, less capitalistically advanced country in the periphery of the global economy. Equally, there's a kind of sense that the prospects for change are being shaped by what's happening elsewhere in these more sort of dynamic, revolutionary countries. If you're missing a bit of Brazilian history, it's a very strange country. Never had a revolution, ever. And its declaration of independence was by the Portuguese monarchy, who fled from Portugal during the era of social revolution in Europe and were just like, okay, so we're pulling up the ladder. Equally, crisis in the European and American core, like the Great Depression or the World Wars, are periods when Brazil has like leaps of industrial development. So that's kind of central to its history. So there's a kind of analogy that's often drawn. Without getting too technical here, like I say, it never has a revolution in the kind of French Revolution, guillotine everyone, start from scratch kind of sense. What it has is what Gramsci calls a passive revolution. There are multiple instances where there are demands, like really radical demands for change at grassroots level in society, but they're basically deflected. They're like, basically those in power already are powerful enough to say, don't want any of that revolutionary change, but we are going to fulfill parts of that program. It relates to what Joel was saying before about the strength of the legislature versus the presidency, right? Institutionally, when there seems to be a push for radical change, like there was just through the 60s, there was a push for agrarian reform, because Brazil has never had agrarian reform, and about 1% of people own about 47% of the land. It's called a latifundio system. There was a push for agrarian reform, and it resulted in a coup. Not a very long coup, wasn't a civil war, just kind of done quite rapidly overnight. But that still involved a degree of modernization, including industrialization, with a very different character, because industrialization was quite exclusionary, not like the kind of industrial revolution in Britain where everyone becomes the proletariat. You end up with a very small industrial core around Sao Paulo and a very large informal sector blocked around it, living in informal communities that we call favelas. It's very, very like an enclave economy of quite rich industrial workers versus the mass of the population, which is very poor. So that's kind of Brazil's path to what we'd call capitalist modernity. It's not all negative. This positivity this is kind of where we come in the 1980s. Out of that crisis of the 1980s that Brazil endures, which I won't try and explain in the available time, you get, you get kind of a positive outcome, which is that very strong, explicitly in favor of social transformation movements crop up. The Central Labor Union, very powerful in Sao Paulo, because that's where your production is. The Workers' Party, we've talked about them a fair bit. They are radically demanding a repudiation of foreign debt and radical agrarian reform, and the MST, the Landless Workers Movement, who, if you're on the European left in a certain period, we absolutely love them. Through the period of neoliberal adjustment, when Brazil's economy is basically ruined by structural reforms, recessions, endemic poverty, increasing inequality, a bunch of landless rural workers organized through an explicitly Leninist platform managed to occupy and expropriate via the state an area of farmland about the size of Wales. So it's an incredible victory. It's about 1.4 million people, but it's amazing. Like from a foreign perspective, looking at that, that's social organization, right? That's how you transform society. The story of the PT is slightly more complex in that they are, at least parts of them at the beginning, they seem to be fully paid up Gramscians. A guy called Carlos Nelson Coutinho, who's in the early days, lives a bit later, says, Brazil in this period has gone from being an Eastern society susceptible to armed conflict to a Western society armored by hegemony. So the PT needs to get into electoral politics, leave the grassroots behind, and play the game of politics to capture positions in civil society. How's that go? I'll try and speed this one up. Basically, there seems to be a very similar strategy to the unification of Italy. It's a very poor, one region of the country very poor, one region very rich. You've got to bring them together. In Italy, called the Southern Question, Brazil, it's called the Northern Question. The North being very poor, South being very rich. The way that Lula manages to bring this together, and we're wondering if he's going to try it again, is he has 2 years of very sharp austerity to pay off external debts, buys himself some policy space, and then leans very heavily into heterodox economic policy, which is based on supporting national champions, national industry, and after the GFC, particularly lots and lots of counter-cyclical spending, like building housing. Minha Casa, Minha Vida, housing project intended to replace favelas. And also these things we call conditional cash transfers, like hammering lots of money into the very poorest families so they keep going to school, accessing public education, that kind of a thing. That leads to very dire consequences for groups like the MST. They were pulling people out of the favelas, but when you're getting formal employment, increasing minimum wage, state supports in a new house, you probably don't want to go and live on the countryside and get beaten up by the cops for 5 years to get your land. As you can see, the chart kind of after 2007, occupations just drop off. It's not possible to organize that way anymore. Equally, you can't expropriate land anymore because it's being made productive. That's the requirement of the Constitution. You can't take land that's productive. So what does the MST do? If you interview them, they use Gramscian language. They say, right, we're in the war of position now. We're going to occupy positions in civil society. That means we're going to have our own schools and education program, and we're going to move towards small peasant farming agriculture called agroecology, which is just very cheap organic farming. That's our project. We're going to be like European style peasants. That's our project of social transformation. How does that end? This is the downer, sorry. If we were hoping that the MST was going to be a force for social transformation, this period suggests probably not. Although they have an overt rhetoric of challenging transnational capital and big business, you get to the grassroots level, you do the qualitative sort of routing through the grassroots, what you actually find is they have a détente with big industrial capital, big agro industry. They basically agree, we're going to stop occupying your land if you just give us a chunk of it to build a school on. So that it's a settlement, it's not revolutionary change anymore. And they become really dependent on electoral politics. Basically, it's not a struggle to transform the state anymore, it's looking to maintain the PT in office. And what the experience is when that coup rolls around in 2016 is that the MST can't really do anything. Without the PET in office, they're more or less impotent. And they've got such a narrow project by this point that they can't really pull the rest of society into it. That's kind of it, unfortunately. So all they're doing now is kind of hoping that Lula gets back in and then we're going to do the whole thing over again. But it's equally structurally vulnerable, right? That's the downer. Sorry, I'm aware I'm probably going to run over by a couple of minutes. Sorry. I'll try and whip through the more optimistic bit, which is the field research I've just come back from. So that's Up to date, that's kind of like, oh God, like it's all going downhill, hope being extinguished. The thing is though, what I've talked about so far is probably a really strange strategic horizon for Brazil. Drawing an analogy between Europe and Brazil, particularly Italy and Brazil, is a really strange idea when you actually look at it. As I think Ricardo mentioned at the beginning, Brazil is a very racially diverse society and it's based on a slave colony. The majority of the Brazilian population doesn't trace back a simplistically European heritage. That's the minority, about 47% of the population, and the rest is of kind of mixed heritage, but particularly African and indigenous. And this idea that you're going to have some kind of identity like a small peasant farmer, which is going to or the proletariat, which is going to represent this population, is kind of ludicrous, right? Building a radical politics on that. But what you actually find is that although Brazil's never had a revolution, it's had an absolute shed load of insurrections. This guy on the right-hand side, probably the most famous African figure in Brazilian history, is called Zumbi. He was a member of an African royal family. His family were taken as slaves, but he gets deeply involved in the Quilombo dos Palmares. It's in the north of Brazil. The Quilombo is like a separatist African colony within Brazil. They break away from Brazilian state power. It doesn't end well, they get crushed. There's other attempts, sorry to people from Rio Grande do Sul, the War of Farroupilhas, to break away and have an insurrection there. Canudos with a more indigenous identity. There's all, and Contestado again, sorry, that's probably the more indigenous one, but there's all these attempts to break away from state power rather than to take it over through a revolution. And central to basically most, if not all of them, is a different racial memory and a different cultural history, a non-European root to it, and a pursuit of an understanding of territory, which is not much to do with the state. This view of autonomy is arising from a different view of territory. Right, so the really optimistic bit. These guys who I've been interviewing for the past 5 weeks really hate being called a social movement. They are an articulation. I can't tell you what that means and why it's different. It seems to be kind of like an umbrella. So Terra dos Povos is literally web of the peoples, but they're kind of disillusioned with all the previous cycle of like Leninist, Gramscian left-wing struggle. And they're quite thin in that they're an umbrella stretching from the north of Brazil down to the south, but not necessarily very populous yet. They're connecting up all different kinds of movements, but based upon this idea of claiming land, understood differently as territory in the pursuit of autonomy. Something very different than not conquering the states. And the idea that their identities are Black and indigenous and what's called popular. So not class-based necessarily. And they're all the kinds of people that were left out of the left-wing vision. Rather than asking for state-led agrarian reform, they're demanding what's called a retomada, a retaking of the land. Saying, look, the 1988 Constitution may say we're allowed to take unproductive land, but we have a claim which stretches further back than any constitution. This is our land, we're taking it. I'm going to skip over a couple of bits of that, but they're basically saying that forget the electoral cycle. As you can understand, I was in Brazil interviewing far left people in the run-up to an election, and I kind of said to them, so what's your hope for when Lula gets re-elected? And one of them amazingly said to me, I don't care if Lula gets elected or Lula da Silva or Jesus Christ, if they enter the Brazilian state, they're not going to get anything. Our political horizon has to be beyond the Brazilian state and the electoral cycle. So forget it, move on. And the more concrete bit of that is that there's a formation through the homeless workers movement of Bahia, of this thing called Quilombo Paraíso. It's a settlement in Salvador, the biggest city in Bahia. And it's called Quilombo for a reason. It's established as a settlement in the urban periphery, intended in the same way as Quilombos were in Brazilian history as a refuge from racialized state violence. It's the idea of a different and alternative political horizon, separate and autonomous from the state, and trying to demand that state public policies, if they are to intrude, are delivered in a way controlled by those social movements and not as a kind of handout. So that's the high point. I've overrun my time, I'm terribly sorry, but that's hopefully in the midst of quite a lot of gloom, at least there is some kind of alternative project that does seem to be taking root. Cool, thanks. Sit down again.
Thanks a lot, Phil. And well, that brings us to the end of the panel, but we will have a little Q&A session now. So if you have a question, also people from Zoom, if you guys have a question, not sure if you have to raise your hand virtually or I just unmute you. But yeah, please feel free to ask any question to our panelists. Anybody wants to go first? Indrajit, you just appeared in your camera, so maybe you want to ask a question?
No, I was just being civil and, thought I should keep my camera on after having put it off for so long. That's all. I don't have a question immediately. I'd like to hear questions from the audience.
Okay.
Side where their political affiliation lay. It feels like they're almost up for grabs by the parties. I wonder if you have a sense as to whether they may be non-voters for the voting age, whether there is maybe a left or right leaning for them. I'm just wondering what you think is the future for that undecided.
More questions and then we round up. Melissa will hand out a microphone as well. We'll just correct the camera here. It's our panelists. And then I'll ask you guys to speak on this. Okay. It's a bit of a weird logistics, but. Okay. Any other questions?
I don't know if it's there. Do I need a mic? Yes. Yeah, cool. Okay. So probably to Joao actually, because I kind of touched on stuff that I would have liked to have talked about. Yes, the Dilma Rousseff presidency does not end well, to say the least, and it ends in an economic crisis. But the question that I guess we're all kind of sifting for now is what could have been done differently. And yeah, that kind of speaks to, is anything more possible next time around if it's someone else? There's a lot of people who just kind of said, well, Dilma Rousseff just wasn't a very charismatic politician, wasn't good at building coalitions in the same way. So it's kind of everything was her fault. And if it had just been someone else, they would have made it. So could you give us a bit more on that? A bit more on what could have been done differently? What were the possibilities?
I think we just do like a round of questions and then.
You'll have to forgive me because I don't really know that much about Brazilian politics, but what I'm quite interested in is recently we've seen like a rise in politicians using things like sport to increase their visibility and kind of legitimacy. So one thing I was wondering is that to what degree, if any, did Bolsonaro use sport to his advantage to kind of increase its legitimacy to his election? And how did, if anybody would know, how did he get any of the quite high-profile footballers to kind of join his crusade?
Thanks a lot, Sam. Should we pass it over to the panelists? Oh, we have another question. Great. I'll just give you Pella.
Yes, sorry. Yeah, it was for Ricardo. Like I was listening on the slide, as there was only like a really small percentage of people that would openly say they were right wing or far right wing. Do you think Bolsonaro managed to win so many votes through fake news and misinformation? And do you think it would work again in the next election?
Cool. Ricardo, do you want to take off the answers and then pass to our other panelists? Oh, Sam, could you just quickly repeat your question to Ricardo?
Yeah, I didn't hear, sorry. I was just wondering to what degree Bolsonaro used sport to increase his kind of legitimacy. To kind of legitimize the regime. How did he use sport? How did he get support? High profile footballers.
The use of sport.
Okay, I will try to respond to you. What's your name?
My name's Alex.
Alex. And you? Paolo. So I try to respond to the first. Thank you for your questions. The colleague that talked with us, what is João? So João called attention for an interesting topic about hate and hope, and that's something that's repeatedly appears in the Brazilian elections. I just need to remember, call attention that the first election that Lula won in 2001, the PSDB, the party of Fernando Henrique Cardoso, the former president, was trying to make an election based on fear. So we had a very famous actress making a campaign that I feel fear for what's going on, what's going to happen in the future of Lula wins, because we have, you probably feel an economic disasters, political disasters, and so on. And the PT campaign responds with hope, saying that hope will beat the fear. So that's why it's not that we are making a panel to support Lula. It's not that, but it's because it's something very present in the Brazilian culture. And what João is calling attention is that that's very interesting, that hope is not the same for all of us. And the main component of the Bolsonarism is not hate. Hate is the response of what mobilized the Bolsonarism, that is fear. Fear, again, mobilized all the Bolsonaristas every day. And the mobilization and the disinformation that Bolsonarism makes about fear of the communists, and everybody's communist if you're not a Bolsonarist. Everybody. You know, if you want to support gay marriage, so you are what we call a gayist. A gayist. I don't know what that's. If you want to make any kind of discussion in schools, sexual education, or even gender, any kind of discussion, you are a communist. And all these communists wants to take over the country, and they want to finish with the traditional family. And what is the traditional family? The father, the wife, the son or the daughter. You must have son or a daughter, just not enough to be a wife and the spouse. So they have hope in this kind of thing. This is one thing. And this is what makes the polarization today in Brazil, in political. So PT, we have a lot of critics for PT during the government. A lot of politics was implemented, like the terrorism law, the anti-terrorism law. Anyway, the PT is painted like a communist party, and it's far from it. It's a center-left party
or a center party. And he does the minimum that we expect as a gain of rights, labor, education, and, gender, and so on. And that's the kind of hope, the minimum hope that we have today. And it's against this kind of hate that is mobilized every day for the Bolsonarism. And that's how they legitimated itself in the actual Brazilian political scenario. Because how João calls attention, the center's party are not ideological party. They are not they don't care about the ideology. They are in any government. They are in the Fernando Cardoso, Lula's, Dilma, Michel Temer, now in Bolsonaro. They are a physiological group of people that just are there to take the money. That's it. And the people who are in the government have to negotiate with this kind of people. That's awful to think about it. So trying to respond about these young people that I interviewed in the political science in general, the ideological scale are not very used because there's a lot of people that don't respond, don't identify themselves in this scale. That's why I make a qualitative research with a lot of these people, these young people. And it's not necessarily that they don't know the scale or don't know how this position works, but they are trying to avoid any kind of situation that can lead to any kind of conflicts that's so present today in every aspect of the sociability. It's amazing. In every, you are walking down the street, if you are minimum in Brazilian protests in favor of Bolsonaro, if you have a person wearing red, you get being targeted as a petista or a communist, just wearing red. It's, people are beaten. So, about the misinformation, so that's one aspect, sorry. These young people, they not necessarily not going to engage in politics publicly. They will avoid to speak in public. They probably will vote, but they just don't want to put I was going to use the expression in Portuguese, translated not to work. Botar cara a tapa não vai funcionar. We just want not to show themselves publicly. But, sorry, I'm talking too much, but I will give just one example. I interviewed one transgender man that in the time of the quantitative research put himself as I'm not identifying any political sides, but suffer so much inside his family. He is from an evangelical family. He was alienated from his mother, from his brother, suffered from the criminalization in work. So he say, I'm against Bolsonaro. So the reality, economical, political reality, put him in a position, but he don't feel comfortable to speak publicly because he's gonna suffer about this. And the misinformation is a very important aspect still today. We sociologists, fortunately or unfortunately, we don't have to put people in laboratory to hear them. So I'm a kind of stalker of everyday speaks of people. And every time that someone's talking about politics, I give some time, some kind of way to try to hear what we're talking. And it's impressive when the people who are talking are supporters of Bolsonaro. Never is an economical preoccupation. They say that all is an invasion of the communists, of the pictures, because the last talk that I heard was that no, the today economic it's okay. In the PT time it was worst, and they believe in it. That's something that will continue for a long time. How to avoid this? One of the ways that I think that is possible, as I was saying before, is to protect the environment of the school, make it a space of free debate. That's one of the things that the far right in Brazil are trying to avoid. The school is far from being perfect, far from it in Brazil especially, but I think that's a way of trying to reverse what's going on in Brazil, not just in Brazil, but in part of the world. I don't know if I don't respond to anybody, but sorry, I just speak too much.
If I can add something that Ricardo said is the role of the public university and the research community in Brazil. I would say that at this point, of course, I totally agree that there is no comparison between Bolsonaro and Lula. And for us, we are suffering a lot in Brazil. The only hope that we have right now is Lula. That's the fact. Of course, I totally agree with João about the contradictions of PT government and how this presidentialism of collision doesn't work in Brazil and the negative effects, but this is the hope right now. But also, Ricardo was mentioned about the role of the schools to at least guarantee a free debate, to guarantee how we can avoid misinformation, fake news, and fake controversies, and clarify with our students how the social media works and produce fake news. And this, of course, has a big influence in terms of elections, in terms of political decisions. But also I would like to call the attention of our role as researchers, as scientists in Brazil. I would say that this is good thing about this catastrophic government that we have right now is that for the first time, I would say the Brazilian scientific community realized that they need to communicate better with the society. We need to show what we're doing in terms of research, in terms of development, innovation, creative solutions at the university. First, of course, because we have to deal with denialism in Brazil, we have to deal with the cuts in budget for research, for studies, but also because I think that it was very clear that we needed to be closer to the society in general. So I would say that from my perspective, if I have to say about hope, I also hope that scientific community right now realize that we need to be closer to the society. Yeah, in terms of education more than schools, I think that we have a big role in this process too. And of course, as social scientists, we need to understand better the effects of the media, the social media in general, in how people vote, how people choose who is the next governor, the next president in Brazil, and how fake news and fake controversies and conspiracy theories are circulating between young people, but also among Brazilians in general. Yeah.
João, do you want to go next?
Yeah, thanks. I didn't get the first question. Sorry. I'm gonna speak to the question about Dilma and what could have been done differently. So I mean, I don't think that the reason for Dilma's downfall is her inaptitude. I think that Dilma as a leader has much to be praised. She made crucial mistakes. She was also handed a poison chalice, I think, by the previous leader, particularly by Lula. I think in order to understand what happened in the coup that led to Dilma's downfall, you need to go back to Lulismo and to understanding the contradictions of Lulismo. Phil, you mentioned in your slide, you mentioned André Singer, and I think he's one of the I think more interesting observers of Lulismo and its contradictions, and particularly how I think there's two things that he does that are very interesting for me. First, he highlights the extent to which Lulismo, if we understand Lulismo as this alignment between the Workers' Party and the poor working classes. Right, so Lulismo is different from the Workers' Party because with Lula you get an alignment between the poorer segments of the Brazilian population and the Workers' Party via Lula da Silva, and this is contingent. And this is what André Singer does, and he shows in his book. This is contingent because, going back to Ricardo's point, traditionally, working poor segments of the population, they tend to vote on the right. They tend to vote conservative in Brazil. And it was only in the re-election of Lula that this changed. The first time Lula was elected, he was elected by the middle class. It was only in this re-election that it shifted, his electorate shifted, and you get a strong alignment between the poor working classes, particularly in the Northeast and the North states, and the Workers' Party. But this is contingent. This is highly contingent in Brazilian history. So Brazil, the government of Lula da Silva rested upon contradictions. It had to cater to a lot of very different interests. On the one hand, there was a pivot towards pro-poor policies, but at the same time, Lula was only able to sustain his parliamentary support because he also wanted to cater to the center parties, and because he also needed to cater to the big industrial financial elites and the agribusiness as well. So this was a precarious balance. And what happened with Dilma was that this balance just completely fell down. And going back to André Singer, he has a paper, which I think also doubles as a chapter in his book, with a very apt title. Translating for English is something like Teasing Jaguars with a Short Stick. Cutucando onça com vara curta. And this is what Singer says that Dilma ended up doing. She teased the Jaguars, and here the Jaguars are the financial elites and the industrial and agribusiness. She teased the Jaguars by advancing some policies that were against their interests, but she had a short stick because her the support that she had in Congress was very precarious. And obviously there were other elements that led to the coup that we need to take into account, including, it was also important, the question of gender and misogyny and then the mobilization of a kind of an anti-Workers' Party mentality via the mainstream media. But fundamentally, this is André Singer's argument, Dilma fell because she couldn't handle the pressures of this precarious arrangement that had been maintained by Lula da Silva. Lula is a master coalition builder. Dilma is not. And this was one of the problems. So what could have done differently? The Workers' Party sadly never presented an alternative project of Brazil's development. it didn't present a project that would radically alter the existing balance of forces in Brazilian society. With Lula, with the Workers' Party, all of the elites profited. The system, the status quo, the economic status quo was maintained by and large. Arguably, and this is undeniably, there was a lot of pro-poor policies. A lot of people went out of poverty. A lot of people were in a situation of hunger and food insecurity. They were lifted out of that. I'm not denying that. This was extremely important. He saved millions of lives. He lifted millions out of poverty. But the fundamental structure of society, it wasn't changed. The elites remained the same. And this, I think, coming from a progressive left, academic left position, this is my insatisfaction with the Workers' Party, is that it failed to challenge the fundamental structures, economic structures of Brazilian society. So what could have done differently to mobilize and to radically challenge and to build a national project, including the working classes, including the middle classes in this national project, which wasn't done. And this was sadly what happened. And I don't think Lula has the profile to fundamentally alter these structures. He is a charismatic figure. He has very many qualities, but he's not one of radical change. He doesn't want to radically change Brazilian society. He wants to lift people out of poverty so that the poor can join the consumer market. This is what it said at some point. My biggest dream, and I'm paraphrasing him, my biggest dream is for the working man to be able to go and buy his beer and to eat meat. This was Lula's dream, to enable poor people to go to the restaurant, to eat meat and to buy beer. In short, to join the consumer market. This was Lula's project. This is not a radical change in the economic structure of society.
Yeah, sure. I agree with that very largely, but and someone asked a question about using sport to kind of launder your reputation. I don't know the answer to that. I do know where I'd probably start looking though. I'm depressing for Liverpool fans, sorry. But someone mentioned about the Bancada Evangelista, right? That evangelicals tend to be identified with the Brazilian right wing. The people who are prominent though, I think it was Roberto Firmino and Alisson, the Brazilian goalkeeper, both evangelicals. I would start looking for where they have supported Bolsonaro through the usual sort of photo ops, that kind of thing. But yeah, to kind of touch on that, what's come out through the field of research that I've done over time with the Brazilian far left is that there's this kind of a vacuum now in Brazil. And it speaks to what someone else said, like, is that 27% is up for grabs. You talk to older PT members, let's say, and they talk a lot about the transformation in Brazilian politics. The PT was born as a political party from the grassroots outside of the legislative system. It wasn't a party that turned into another party like we have in the UK, or that broke off. It was literally formed outside. And they used to have an amazing grassroots campaigning game, and they left it behind under the Lula presidency. So they just turned away to a properly like European style professional party. Like, so the party effectively still bigger than its members except Lula. That kind of thing being abandoned is a major problem, like pulling back from grassroots transformative activism. And there is a tension to explore there because, as we know, established leaders in political parties don't like the grassroots because they're more radical. The grassroots campaigners are always to the left of those who are in secure office, who want to kind of not rock the boat and keep the coalition going. So I think that's kind of the problem that we're in. Can the PT or some other party like return to its roots and be a proper grassroots campaigning organization with all the danger that involves, particularly in Brazil? I don't know if that's hopeful or not, but that's what I got to say. Cool.
All right, everybody. So we have to thank all our panelists for this incredible and very thoughtful session, with the hope that Bolsonaro is defeated this year. And if not Lula, but social movements or anything can bring some fresh air to Brazilian society, culture, and economics. Before I give the floor to Melissa, she wants to make an invitation to you, I just have to thank also Dr. Indrajit and Melissa, who have personally helped me to organize this event under the framework of the York Hope Consortium that they together coordinate here. So this is an event being organized under their framework, and also to the Department of Politics and the Research Center for Social Sciences for helping us to fund this event. Melissa?
Thank you. Just a really quick announcement. So yeah, we have our next talk for Hope Consortium on the 12th of May. That's at 2 p.m. and that is Whistleblowing, Speaking Truth to Power with, it's a seminar with Ian Foxley, a PhD student who's also in the Department of Politics.
Great. Phil, you wanted to make an invitation as well?
Oh, right. Okay, sorry. Right. Deluging you with Brazilian stuff at the moment. One of the great commentators on the Brazilian far left right now is called Sabrina Fernandes. None of her works are in English, I don't think, but she is a joint Canadian citizen. We're very lucky that she's coming to the University of York to give us a masterclass on how to do effective grassroots activism, very handy, and also on this tension between authoritarianism and ecological alternatives that we're seeing globally right now. So the research presentation that she's going to do should be on the 10th of May, not long from now. It's a great time to turn up, pick up these themes again, and we'll advertise it properly through the same channels as this. But do come along to it because she's a really great speaker and really does have her fingers on the pulse of Brazilian politics, so you can bombard her with more of this stuff as well if you want. She's got it covered. Cool.
Cool. Thanks
for coming.
Right. Yeah, let's give a round of applause.